Okay, welcome to the final unit. It's Unit 10 Trauma. This is a unit that kind of is getting a lot more talk than it used to, and at the same time goes to the core of some of the oldest parts of our body and our mind. Trauma, as many of you know, is something that can be absolutely debilitating. It is something that can sideline people's entire lives. It's something that we feel like we know a lot about, and yet a lot of it is still up for figuring out. There's a ton of research in this area. It's fascinating. A lot of, as I kind of say in the slide here, a lot of what we're going to be doing today is informed by Gabor Mate, one of the kind of pillars of our courses, our course. So let's get into it. Trauma. So we're gonna do an activity here just to start. I call it "The World Is Not Well." It doesn't have a question mark, but it's kind of intended to be with a question mark. And the whole idea here is for us to think about: are we in the greatest time of human existence, and are humans in general in the greatest time of any species existence? What do we use to determine that, and how can we know? And why is it we have, for example, more people identifying with depression than we've ever had identifying before? So kind of to set up our conversation today, looking at trauma. So after we have a little bit of time with class discussion, we're going to jump into doing a bit of reflection and then sharing out on these four quotes that I've kind of brought, two from Gabor and two from other people who have a lot to say in attachment and a lot to say um, in trauma and how the body shows up. These people all understand the interconnectedness between the most core central parts of our mind that we learned about in our first unit with how trauma exists inside our body and our emotions. We all know this. We can feel things in our body physically that are manifested through our internal thoughts. So we're going to take a little bit of look just to go deeper into the idea of how we frame our world as young kids. We've talked about this before, and then how various versions of how our world is framed can determine our outlooks and how trauma might affect that. So we'll then take Gabor's ideas around mental illness and bring them in for conversation. And I want to be really clear that these are ideas that are being adopted by a lot of people and also are with some controversy. I myself find a little bit of split on this. I really buy into it, but I wonder if one thing can really explain everything. Gabor's hot take, so to speak, is that mental illness is a construct created by society. What's going on is that people are mentally injured, and he uses um, the idea, and I'll explain it more in class, that because of trauma, we can struggle to get through day-to-day life in ways that aren't just survivalist. That people who have mental illness are actually just injured and surviving. They're coping. They're figuring out how to best get through their day. Um, and he says that if we think of people as being mentally ill, there's a degree of permanence to that. And if we think about mental injury, there's a degree of um, ability to come back from that. When we're injured, we can return to normal. Illness doesn't always allow for that. And so he says that the wording is important. And he also, and that part I think is more widely agreed upon. But what he also says is that trauma is going to be the base of why people have mental illnesses. He's going to, as you can kind of guess, going back to some of our earlier work, he's much more into the environmental side of things than he is into the biological. So we'll take a little bit of time to jump into something called ACEs, and these are tough. Well, so shocking. The trauma lesson has tough things. Um, this was based on, and I'll talk about this more in class, but based on trying to learn to understand what was going on in the American prison system. Why is it that there were people that seemingly had a lot of similarities? Now, we know that, for example, there's a massive, and this is in the States, there's a massive degree, continues to be, of racist um, undertones that allow people of color to be put into penitentiaries and prisons. It's pretty widely known at this point. We also know that males are much higher than females. We can see some biological factors like sex at birth. We can also see some things like through society, being BIPOC, increasing the likelihood in Canada. As much as we love to throw shade to the states, we're no better. Our indigenous population is substantially oversubscribed. Not sure, probably a better word, over uh, in in prisons than non-indigenous people. It's staggering. Um, we also know now from the work of ACEs that we'll spend some time talking about that there are environmental factors. And I don't mean environmental like water and sun, I mean environmental like how you were raised. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what you think those are. And then on the next slide, I'll show you. I challenge you to skip this slide and not stop on it. Do it in class. Okay, so we'll jump in from understanding ACEs, and hopefully you took the time to not stop on the slide and read them all so that you could look real smart in class. I think it'd be more fun to do it as an activity, um, and a better discussion from it. We're going to then talk a little bit about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, something that originally came out of the war when psychologists and psychiatrists were trying to gain an understanding of what was going on for what we called shell shock for quite a while. Those of you who've already done your socials 10, which is pretty much should be everybody, will have a better understanding of what shell shock was. Um, we came to realize that when people are in really traumatic situations, it can almost like how you say rewire your brain, so to speak. There's specific PTSD requirements, and I think these are really misunderstood, so I wanted to put these up here. I know for a while everybody liked to say that's so OCD, or oh yeah, I'm just being OCD. And then PTSD kind of became the next thing that people often did that with, I've noticed. And so just to try to destigmatize what actually that's about so that people don't misuse this label, I wanted to share it. So the requirements of PTSD is an exposure to a threat. Although you don't have to have directly experienced it. You already know what I'm going to say here. This is, of course, an example being in like residential schools, like we talk about in here for peers. Now, the presence of an intrusive symptom. So this is really saying that like it it comes to you and um, it's unwanted. Okay. The number three one, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the event. So people with PTSD will go incredibly out of their way to avoid anything that might make them feel like that moment or remind them of the moment or moments that they existed in. For some people, the trauma can be very short. Um, for others, it can be like a war, for example, where it carries on for years. And one isn't necessarily better or worse. The how they are interpreted and how they are internalized will determine how well somebody's able to deal with them. The more internalization and um, the more time on the brain, the worse it'll be. Number four, negative alteration in cognition and mood. This is just you're going to see some things that'll sometimes look like depression and less of arousal and energy. Arousal and energy in this case are just like a lack of interest in doing things. Um, and complex PTSD, as you can see, is a subtype. I know some people like to use this as a subtype of PTSD, where the PTSD is generated over multiple events. Okay, so this is taken a little bit from the work of Mr. Van Life Coach Brene Brown, as we like to say. So this idea that in order for trauma to go from being a significant and life altering event to being something that becomes internalized and taken on to be truly part of oneself, which is what actually allows the trauma to um, infiltrate and change the life and the thinking patterns and the ways of being of the person who's having the event. In order for it to actually become more than just a really challenging life event, um, Bernays says that a massive way to increase the likelihood is with shame. We've talked a bit about shame and guilt and how guilt is good for us and reminds us that we can do better, and shame is an internalization of a belief that we're not enough. And Brene says, and I quite agree with her here, and others do as well, um, that feeling that we are not worthy, that there is something intrinsically wrong with us, that we are flawed, that is what allows a traumatic experience to take hold in our minds and to become something that we lose control over. Lose control over. Um, yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is our boy Gabber. This is a slightly younger version from 2013, 13 years ago, from the time of this video that I'm making. I'll show this in class quite likely. It's a little longer at 20 minutes, but it's quite interesting because he's talking about um, the the connection between trauma and addiction, and how his work on the downtown east side really informed his understandings that people who were living there all had trauma. None of them had that he was ever aware of, and he worked with literally hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people on the downtown east side as a medical doctor, giving giving frontline service as like a family physician. Um, None of them had stories where they weren't traumatized. None of them had addiction without trauma. And he came to the conclusion that addiction takes hold when trauma is present and you are so desperately looking for an opportunity to numb out the thing you're trying to avoid. Remember, going back to that PTSD designation, for example, or diagnosis, for example, you're actively looking to repress and push away those feelings, those thoughts. You're avoiding any situation that might bring rise to it. And we know this is true of kind of softer situations as well, like with anxiety. We know that people will avoid in social situations things that might remind them of what they might feel deficient in for a social anxiety disorder, for example. At the time in 2013, and even now, but especially in 2013, this was very cutting edge, and very few people were onto it or necessarily buying what he was selling, so to speak. But it's gained a lot of traction now, and increasingly we understand that addiction is trauma's way of hiding. It's trauma's way of escaping. It's trauma's way of pretending something didn't happen. And he says that trauma knows no limits to what we will actually do to not feel the thing we don't want to feel, which is why people will ingest some of the most horrific things that they know might actively kill them. They actively, cognitively understand that they're ingesting something that could kill them, and yet still they want to hide so badly, which speaks to how powerful trauma can be. So this will be the last slide that we cover in the video here. There is one more, but I'll save it for class. Um, I updated this one just now. This is about being trauma informed. And originally I had a slide that was a bit more clinical, but I've come to realize that like being trauma informed is just something that we need in all elements of our life and our work. And actually, just to be clear, not saying I figured this out or something. This is trauma. Being a trauma informed is included in jobs and work and schools all over the place. VSB, for example, has information and in service for staff members to try to be trauma informed as much as possible. So here are the key takeaways. We'll talk about a bit in class, but relationship is everything. Remember the number 42. Well, it matters especially in trauma. Go slowly and take your cues from others. Too often, people who have gone through traumatic events are tasked with pushing through that quickly. Um, for example, there's a commonly known, it's not really a stat, but a commonly known fact that people who've had traumatic experiences in childhood will like it's quite impressive what the mind can do, will actually be able to use their brain, or their brain subconsciously, I should say, will um, hold that memory until such time that they feel as though they are safe. It's very common for child abuse, sexual child abuse, and things like this, horrible things, to be suppressed until adulthood, 17, 18, 25, 30. And then what comes as little drips and drabs of memory become much clearer. It's just the brain's way of trying to protect itself. It's an incredible machine, our brain, an incredible organism. The next thing we need to make sure we externalize. I put an example question down there. So we would want to ask a question like, "What happened to you?" rather than "What's wrong with you?" When we internalize the problem, it doesn't support people coming up. Um, and then the last thing, just to understand that a person's difficult behavior, like, and we've all seen this, things where people are doing things and we're like, why are you doing that? You must know that's kind of antisocial, that's not helpful. But that often, if there's a trauma response behind why they're acting the way they are, this is a survival mechanism. We need the empathy to understand this in order to really support people. Okay, well done, everybody.